to the Egenis seminar series. It's a real delight for me to introduce Greg. I've known Greg since about 2009, I think, when he wrote to me to say he thought that we were working on the same PhD in two different institutions, and maybe we should talk about that. That's the kind of thing that either makes someone a good friend or a really bitter enemy. I'm glad to say that Greg is mostly the former. So Greg is currently a Wellcome Trust Research Fellow at the University of Leeds. He's in the last year of a 3-year fellowship. And next year, and I think I'm allowed to say this, he's going to move to a permanent post at the University of Sheffield at the iHuman Centre on foot of a Wellcome Trust University Award, which is, of course, a massive achievement. Greg his work spans, I think, medical sociology, STS, and social theory, and is broadly concerned with the brain and mind sciences. He's published extensively on the historical sociology of autism. He's currently working on brain injury and concussion in relation to sport, and he starts a new project on Alzheimer's disease next year. He's also written on questions of animals and the environment with Eva Giraud and with other colleagues. He's co-editing a sociology of health and illness monograph on complicity with Ros Williams. He's written on public engagement with Warren Pierce. He's one of the authors of, I think, the best critical paper out there on Karen Barad, with Eva Giraud, Isla Forsyth, and Tracy Potts. His work has appeared in Social Studies of Science, in Social Science and Medicine, in Biosocieties, and History of the Human Sciences, and many, many others. I could be here for some time. But today's talk is from his current concussion work, and very excitingly, I think it's the first presentation of several years' worth of ethnographic data Greg has been collecting on this. So it's a real privilege to hear it here at Egenis. He's going to talk for about 50 minutes, I think, and then we'll open up to questions in the usual way. We'll ask people to use the raise hand function, please, for that. And if you don't know, they've moved that in Zoom, so it's under reactions if you can't find it. The talk is called Hard Knock Life, Concussion, Dementia, and Sport. So without further ado, let me hand over to Greg Holland. Greg.
Thanks so much, Des. Thank you so much for having me here. Des has heard this story before, and I'm not quite sure how many of you are based in Exeter, but actually, I visited Egenis once before, which was in 2008, just as I'd finished my undergraduate degree, which was in experimental psychology. And at the time I was doing kind of psychology of pain perception. And I was kind of getting fed up with the idea of how pain was being taught in psychology. And I kind of stumbled across Darwin's Legacy by John Dupre and sent him a random email asking him if he thought I might be able to do a PhD, maybe with Egenis. So I kind of boldly drove down from Leicester on the day, which in retrospect was, bold. And I came down, and I have this really strong memory. At the time, I had a haircut even more ridiculous than the one I have now. It was this bright blue Mohican. And stepping in John Dupre's office, which looks like it's kind of straight out of Atonement, and being completely shocked by what was happening, being taken for lunch by a PhD student who was very clear that I just hadn't ever lived if I hadn't had potatoes cooked in goose fat. And coming back from lunch, going to a seminar, like Jonathan did this really great job putting all this stuff on for me, going to this seminar that certainly in retrospect must have been Giuseppe Testa, I think. And, bearing in mind, I was a psychology student, had no idea what was going on, came out, and these PhD students were talking about who owns an umbilical cord. And I was just what on earth is this? And getting taken, in my head it was taken upstairs to a turret, but I've looked at the Egenis house and it doesn't look like it's got a turret. But being taken up into this turret to see someone who I wouldn't have known from Adam, who turned out to be Barry Barnes. And Barry Barnes said, after sort of 5 minutes of conversation, he said, I don't think you're really interested in the psychology of pain, Greg. I think what you're interested in is the sociology of neuroscience. And I was just is the sociology of scientific knowledge a thing? And obviously Barry Barnes is just let me tell you about how it's a thing. So anyway, I went home from that day and straight away Googled sociology of neuroscience, emailed the first name that I came across, which was Nick Rose, only to be told that I couldn't do a PhD with Nick Rose because someone else had just started a PhD on that topic. And that was the first, but as today has proven, definitely not the last time that I was gazumped by one Des Fitzgerald. So all of that is to say, I'm really pleased, even virtually, to be back in Egenis. It feels really, I'm really pleased to be able to do that, basically. And also to say that in the event that in 20 minutes you're thinking, I really wish I'd gone to that talk by Hugh Raffles, which is going on at the same time. In a strange kind of way, it's Barry Barnes's fault. Okay, so yeah, I felt it was like I'd been thinking about that all week, so I thought I'd get out there, but now and get on it and kind of talk about this ethnographic work, which Des so kindly introduced. And yeah, look forward to your questions. So on the 24th of September 2002, Mike Webster, a Hall of Fame American football player who won 4 Super Bowls as part of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Are you okay?
Yeah, we can hear you, Greg.
Oh, right, sorry, I heard someone else. So on September 24, 2002, Mike Webster, a Hall of Fame American football player who won 4 Super Bowls as part of the Pittsburgh Steelers, died age 50 after suffering a heart attack. As described in League of Denial, a book which chronicles Webster's life and death, Webster experienced years of physical and mental health problems prior to his passing. Webster was divorced, homeless, and suffered extreme mood swings. He would wrap his feet in duct tape as a remedy to the constant pain caused by long bleeding cracks, which made it difficult to walk. His teeth were falling out, and so he simply superglued them back in. His, quote, fingers were so mangled, his knuckles so swollen, that he couldn't hold a pen for very long. To write, he used the same duct tape that had held his feet together and wrapped it around his fingers, unquote. Perhaps most shockingly, Webster would self-medicate with a high-voltage stun gun that he used to fall asleep. And despite these very evident injuries, it was actually microscopic brain changes that made Mike Webster famous for a second time. So Bennett Amalu, a neuropathologist, here standing with Will Smith, who played him in a film, Amalu conducted Webster's autobiography and prepared slices of Webster's brain for examination under a microscope. In this autobiography, Amalu described what he saw. Quote, these slides did not appear like they should belong to a 50-year-old man. Each slide contained numerous brain cells, yet many had died and disappeared, and many appeared like ghost cells. A large number of the remaining cells appeared shriveled, as if in the midst of the throes of death. I observed spaces, spongiosis, in the absence of the brain, with shriveled brain skeleton and skeins of brain scars, like a partially demolished building stripped of its window and its aesthetics gone, leaving behind just the main frame, pillars, and broken walls. On the basis of these observations, Amalu lead authored a paper which diagnosed Mike Webster as the first football player with chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. So CTE is a neuropathologically distinct and slowly progressive tauopathy with a clear environmental etiology. And the CTE is, quote, clinically associated with symptoms of irritability, impulsivity, aggression, depression, short-term memory loss, and heightened suicidality. With advancing disease, more severe neurological changes develop that include dementia, gait and speech abnormalities, and Parkinsonianism. And it's that clear environmental etiology, chiefly mild traumatic brain injury, like those suffered by Mike Webster on the football field, that is responsible for much of the attention that CTE as a diagnosis receives. In the years since Webster's posthumous diagnosis, there's been a significant increase in discussion surrounding the link between head trauma and dementia. Indeed, a recent article in the Washington Post described Amalu as being, quote, responsible for the most important sports story of the 21st century. Concerns about CTE have inspired a global revolution in concussion safety and fueled an ongoing existential crisis for America's most popular sport, unquote. And while attention has centered upon American football, at least partially because of staggering graphics like these in the NYT, the matter extends far beyond the space, with concussion now understood as offering a threat to Australian rules football, bobsled, cricket, ice hockey, mixed martial arts, to military personnel, including those who suffer from so-called Havana syndrome, in rugby league, rugby union, soccer, and volleyball, and many more besides. And not included in these stories are others understood to be at risk, most notably domestic abuse victims. So with a focus upon sport, both academics and wider groups have tended to corral these cases under the banner of the concussion crisis. But I think it's worth noting that quite a bit of work goes into the production of something that we might think of as a singular concussion crisis, because there are at least 5 elements to this story. So first, whereas concussions may have frequently been treated as something of a joke, there is an increasing recognition that, particularly if left untreated and or if players return to the field of play, concussions can sometimes be a serious medical event. To this end, the so-called Lightstead laws, which have been adopted in all 50 US states and prevent return to play after a diagnosed concussion, were named after teenager Zachary Lightstead, who in 2006 suffered life-changing injuries following a concussion suffered while playing American football. Secondly, and very closely related, there are fears about so-called second impact syndrome. And this is a notion which suggests that the aforementioned medical events are more likely if 2 concussive blows are experienced in quick succession. Third is discussion of post-concussion syndrome. And this is wherein symptoms associated with concussion, which normally subside within days or weeks, last for months or maybe even years. And the volleyball player Hayley Hodgson is a high-profile example of this. And in a recent book, medic Elizabeth Sandor suggested that actually potentially up to 30% of those with a concussion might develop PCS, making it far more common than has largely been believed. Fourth is the matter of sub-concussion. So here it's posited that actually the concussion crisis is a misnomer, and that it's not concussions that lead to dementia, but sub-concussions, which are not subjectively experienced as injurious. In this regard, debate in the UK has centred on soccer and heading, but the matter is applicable far more widely and potentially poses an intractable problem across many sports. So a good example of that comes from a paper recently published in JAMA Neurology, wherein sensors were fixed to American football players' helmets to examine head impacts. And in that study, it was found that roughly 1 in 10 players were diagnosed with concussion. However, there were over 500,000 head impacts recorded, with a median of 415 per player per season. And if those are dementia-causing impacts, then it's quite hard to see how that risk could be significantly mitigated by rule change, for example. Finally, and to loop back to the beginning, we have the issue of CTE, which is a condition no longer the exclusive domain of American football, as demonstrated by The Guardian's recent and blanket coverage of dementia in rugby union. So the social scientific response to the concussion crisis, certainly outside of the fairly well insulated subfield of the sociology of sport, has been fairly muted, I would say. Within the sociology of sport, work has frequently had a number of features in common. So firstly, research has been overwhelmingly focused upon media analyses, which seems reasonable given that, as we've seen through my slides, CTE and concussion are heavily mediatized conditions. Second, and related, work is oriented towards elite and usually professional athletes. And third, the literature has sought to explain responses to the concussion crisis primarily through explorations of gender and masculinity. So whether that's through Norbert Elias and the civilizing process, Raewyn Connell and hegemonic masculinity, Bourdieu and masculine domination, or the more diffuse power relations of Foucault, the literature's pole star is that the sports field is a primary site for the expression or formation of a masculine warrior narrative, and that CTE needs to be understood primarily or perhaps even solely in that context. And in many ways, these are sensible approaches to the topic, but there are certainly some consequences. So the unrelenting focus on the media means that there's relatively little emphasis being given to understanding how sporting communities are themselves responding to the concussion crisis on a day-by-day basis. Despite the orientation towards elite sport, if the concussion crisis is a public health crisis, and it is increasingly framed and acted upon as such, then the overwhelming majority of those impacted will be playing sport at a local and amateur level. And finally, an exclusive focus upon masculinity is not entirely a good thing, in my opinion. So if sporting subjectivities are simply an epiphenomenon of a macro-sociological process like hegemonic masculinity, then it makes sense to collapse all sporting practices into one another, for they're simply slightly different manifestations of the same underlying process. And this, I think, does something of a disservice to some of the local material and semiotic differences between sporting communities that, as a kind of generally STS type person, I'm immediately drawn to. And so it's into this milieu that I come and pitch my project. So I'm conducting locally situated fieldwork when COVID allows, with 3 sports teams in the north of England. So I spent the first 3 months of 2020 with American footballers before their season was cancelled. All being well, they should be starting up again in a couple of weeks, and I'll be returning to them for the new season. I've spent the past 6 months, admittedly more off than on, with a local soccer club, speaking to parents and children playing age group soccer. And finally, I spent all of 2019 working with professional wrestlers. And then kind of alongside that local work, I'm also conducting an overarching multi-sited ethnography of the emerging scientific field, with a particular focus on sports science and allegations of a conflict of interest, which are very widespread. And so while it would obviously be futile to attempt to understand the concussion crisis in its full complexity, my hope is that through these 4 knots of American football, youth soccer, professional wrestling, and academic research, all of which contribute to this densely tangled fabric, that they'll contrast in some interesting ways and allow for some insight into how diagnostic entities, traumatized brains, and forms of sporting subjectivity are co-emerging in this space. And for the remainder of the talk, I'm going to focus specifically on one of these field sites, and this is where I've been able to undertake the most work, and that is professional wrestling. But obviously, I'm happy to return to any of these other kind of areas if people are interested in the questions. So, as I mentioned briefly, I spent all of 2019 conducting ethnographic fieldwork in and around the independent professional wrestling scene. So I attended some shows ranging from those hosted by the WWE, a global brand with an annual revenue approaching $1 billion. For those of you who grew up watching Hulk Hogan or The Rock, the WWE was previously known as the World Wrestling Federation, or the WWF, until in 2002, the World Wildlife Fund brought a lawsuit and they were forced to change their name to World Wrestling Entertainment, or WWE. So WWE and WWF are the same thing. So anyway, I attended WWE shows, those run by Progress, who are probably the biggest British promoter, and then with 2 differently sized promoters based in the north of England. So both of these local promoters, who have a significant crossover in personnel, allowed me to hang around outside of opening hours in order to get a sense of their backstage operations. And for the full year, sorry, not missed that slide, I also attended a wrestling school that was affiliated with these promotions. It was in this wrestling school that I spent the majority of my time, surrounded by abandoned cups of Tim Hortons coffee and innumerable cans of Pipeline Punch Monster Energy drink, watching wrestlers of various experience train in the hope of one day climbing the ladder and appearing on the WWE stage. And it perhaps tells you something interesting about wrestling, that I in fact saw that happen in 2019. So I saw someone wrestle in all 4 of these venues in the same year. And it was also with folks who attended this training school that I conducted interviews. So these interviews were undertaken mainly with wrestlers, but also with coaches, referees, and promoters, and often people occupy more than one role. And just before moving on, to add a couple of disclaimers. Firstly, there are some wrestlers identifiable in photographs here, and where that's the case, they've agreed to the use of their image. Secondly, when images appear alongside quotes, I'm not suggesting that the photo is of the person being quoted, because it usually isn't. And third, many of the wrestlers work across innumerable promotions. So incidents that they discuss during interview and that I might talk about here didn't necessarily happen in my primary fieldwork sites. So I know there's a couple of people here who know more about wrestling than I do, but for those of you who know less than me, for present purposes, I think there are 3 things that it's important to know about professional wrestling. So the first, and if you know anything about pro wrestling at all, it would be that wrestling is fake. So fake doesn't really begin to capture what is happening in wrestling. As fan study scholar Henry Jenkins says, wrestling is perhaps best thought of as, quote, monstrous and perverse, a horrifying hybrid, not sports entertainment, not real, not fake, but someplace in between. We might call wrestling the unreal since it stands on the border between fact and fiction, unquote. And to clarify that a little further, the resultant courses of matches are determined in advance. And while it appears that wrestlers are competing against each other, they're actually working with each other in a choreographed performance that enables the telling of a story while attempting to keep each other safe in the process. As wrestlers will very readily tell you, however, to say that wrestling is scripted and that performers try to keep each other safe is absolutely not the same as saying that wrestling is not physical or dangerous. As one interviewee said to me, quote, essentially, it's really hurting yourself deliberately to try and act like you're hurt more than you actually are, which is such a weird thing to explain to someone. It's gonna hurt, but you're gonna have to pretend that it hurts 10 times more than it ever does. So on that count, wrestlers really do hit each other, but sometimes at less than full force and while aiming for body parts where less damage is done. So, for example, what appears to the audience as a full uppercut aimed at the chin may actually be targeted at the upper chest. Likewise, wrestlers really do slam themselves and each other into the ground with tremendous force. Indeed, even very run-of-the-mill moves like this hip toss involve significant impact. And these so-called bumps are performed onto rings that are essentially metal plyboard and a thin covering of foam. And for what it's worth, the most common point of comparison made by wrestlers to what bumping feels like was a low-speed car crash. Further, and amongst my interviewees at least, this was the most common cause of concussion. So when like wrestlers are throwing themselves onto the floor like this, it's essentially like a break fall. So they kind of throw their arms out and try and make a noise and make the fall as safe as possible. But when that's happening, it's really important that they tuck their chin into their chest, because if you don't tuck your chin in, the back of your head will hit the ring really hard, basically. And that's a very, very almost ubiquitous, I would say, error amongst the beginners who I spoke to, who say that you'll almost certainly experience whiplash and slam the back of your head into the ring. Okay. So second, and perhaps unsurprising, given the above, wrestling has been implicated in the concussion crisis. So in 2007, Chris Benoit, one of the best known wrestlers in the world, murdered his wife and son before killing himself. And his brain was one of the first examined by Bennett Amalu, the neuropathologist played by Will Smith, previously discussed. And Benoit was amongst the first individuals in the world to be posthumously diagnosed with CTE. Chris Nowinski, a Harvard-educated sociologist, co-founder of the Concussion Legacy Foundation and a core member of the Boston University CTE Center, those are arguably the most important nonprofit and research hub for CTE, respectively, was previously known as Chris Harvard Nowinski in the WWF before being forced to retire because of post-concussion syndrome. And Bryan Danielson, aka Daniel Bryan, another of the world's most popular wrestlers and one who honed his craft at Butlins Holiday Resort, had recently returned to the WWE after a 2-year forced retirement as a result of 10 documented concussions and a tear on the brain. Finally, and while conducting during the period when I was taking field work, Ashley Masaro, a 39-year-old former WWE wrestler, died by suicide. It was widely reported that Masaro would be donating her brain to science, presumably the CTE Center in Boston. And it's worth noting to this end that Masaro was part of a class action lawsuit brought against the WWE in 2016, very recently revived, but definitely on its last legs, and had previously stated that she had suffered with depression and memory loss as a result of the, quote, routine repetitive blows suffered to the head I received in the ring over the course of my career and which were not properly diagnosed or treated, unquote. Finally, and third, wrestling has absolutely no formal governance or governing infrastructure. And this is a point which is perhaps most clearly elucidated by point of comparison. So soccer has a very well-developed governing infrastructure. Globally, there is a governing body, FIFA, a rulemaking body, IFAB, and a players' union called FIFPro. UEFA runs the game on a European-wide level, and nationally in England, we have the FA as a governing body, and the PFA as a players' union. And there are a few more stakeholders than this, like the Premier League, for example. But for present purposes, it will do. And in soccer, as in most other sports, it's within this regulatory framework that formal action on concussion almost invariably occurs. So just focusing on the national level, the FA founded an expert panel on concussion in 2016, and this panel funds scientific research, which feeds back to the panel and the FA, and partially on the basis of these findings, the FA issued concussion guidelines, which, for example, mean that coaches are encouraged to carry a pocket diagnostic, that anyone with suspected concussion is removed from play, and that there are enforced periods of rest and return to play protocols. At the same time, the FA, the PFA, and a variety of other stakeholders have a coaching working group who receive input from a concussion research task force, as well as that funded research. And this working group has produced heading guidelines that ban heading in training for under 12s, limit it for under 18s, and regulate the size and pressure of footballs. And finally, the PFA have their own neurodegenerative disease working group. And this is just at the national level. So UEFA are also developing their own heading guidance. IFAB have a concussion expert group who recently implemented the trialing of concussion substitutions, and so on and so forth. And the specifics here aren't super important for present purposes, but what this dense developing regulatory structure does at a minimum is something like the following. So first, it establishes concussion as a significant medical issue, a fairly straightforward process of institutional medicalization that must be engaged with by stakeholders. Second, it establishes head injury as a qualitatively distinct form of injury. These are organizations who already had significant medical bureaucracies, but the concussion crisis has seen the creation of specialist working groups, specialist task force, specialist guidance, specialist concussion substitutions, and so forth. Finally, and importantly, almost all regulation of head injury in sport has come through regulatory bodies like these. So whilst the actors do occasionally involve themselves in the concussion crisis, this is unusual, and it's almost always governing bodies like the FA who take action. So this is the regulatory situation in soccer, and it's pretty typical. And this, by contrast, is the regulatory infrastructure in wrestling. So there is absolutely none. There is simply no infrastructure within which a response to the concussion crisis can be embedded. So the WWE has some in-house rules in the wake of Chris Benoit's murder-suicide, for example. They've banned chair shots to the head, and a few moves such as the brainbuster or flying headbutt that are seen to carry a particularly high risk have also been banned. But they're not a governing body and basically have no jurisdiction or influence really over anyone but themselves. And this is aptly demonstrated by the fact that I started this section of the talk off with a picture of someone whacking someone else on the head with a chair in front of about 30 people during my fieldwork. Wouldn't be allowed in WWE. So given this, I think it's worth spending just a couple of minutes to detailing what exactly medical provision is and what it looks like in the fieldwork sites, given that there is no overarching regulation. And one of the most striking manifestations of regulatory absence was that absolute lack of paperwork. So the wrestling school where I was based was housed in a building that was shared with, amongst others, a gymnastics club. Out on the walls outside of the gymnasium, a vast array of forms was on public display. 2 forms from the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, an equality policy, a regional gymnastic association affiliation form, 3 forms relating to liability insurance, a child protection and concern flowchart, details of the qualifications in gymnastics, safeguarding and first aid, which were held by all coaches, details of welfare support officer. And forms like these do significant work as material objects in and of themselves, but they also represent visible nodes of dense and far-reaching networks. And by contrast, the only paperwork at the wrestling school was a disclaimer to be signed, sometimes after training, sometimes never at all, by trainees. And I note in passing that I completed as much paperwork before I gave this seminar. So just as the bureaucracy of the gymnastics centre represented an entry point into an extended infrastructure, the absence of paperwork in the wrestling school was indicative of further formal absences. So there are no coaching qualifications in wrestling. You simply declare yourself to be a coach, and you do not need to demonstrate technical or pedagogical skill, complete a DBS check, be first aid, undertake an induction, nor sign any paperwork. You just get on with it, and you or I could readily declare ourselves to be a pro wrestling coach. On every occasion that I saw it called for, there was no access to basic first aid. And it probably goes without saying that there was nothing like the pitch-side concussion diagnostic recommended by the Football Association. Eva's teaching's finished, everyone. Unless an injury caused an obvious issue for others, for example, because a wrestler was bleeding in the ring, it was generally up to the injured person to self-diagnose and then sort themselves out. And in the case of concussion, this usually meant having a bit of a sit down and a glass of water. And accidents, if they were noticed, weren't recorded. Now, it may be that we expect greater medical provision at a show than at training. So in American football in the UK, for example, a paramedic needs to be present at a match, but they don't need to be there for training. In wrestling, however, much the same situation seemed to apply. So again, just to give brief examples, before a show starts, all the wrestlers gather around the head promoter for a team talk. In the team talk, the promoter will give a brief overview of the schedule. So they'll say, in the first match, wrestler A will beat wrestler B, and so forth. They'll outline some company rules. So the promotion in question here bills itself as a family show. So even though wrestlers are expected to interact with the crowd, they're not allowed to swear while they're doing so. And the promoter might also detail any specific requirements for the day. So for example, if a wrestler in the main event uses a particular move, it may well be that all others on the show are forbidden from using that move on the day. And during the team talk, key personnel are identified. So we say Alan and Connor are on commentary. If you want them to say something in particular, you need to let them know. Jim is taking promo photos. Make sure you find him as soon as you're kitted up. And it is, in other words, the wrestling version of the chair's housekeeping speech at the beginning of an academic conference. At no point in any of these team talks did I ever hear medical provisions or key personnel identified. And while this definitely isn't the same as saying that there wasn't any medical provision, although there might not have been, wrestlers frequently said that, like me, they would have had no idea where to go to find it. As one wrestler said in a lucid but fairly typical response to my question on this matter, oh yeah, you wouldn't know where the band-aids are, you wouldn't know where a plaster is. And this, by the account of interviewees, generally led to a situation similar to that which occurred in training. Namely, that unless a determination was made that someone needed to go to hospital, they were basically left to their own devices. As one interviewee recounted, there was a massive, 10-woman rumble thing. And at the end of it, I'd been eliminated. And the name of another wrestler, I think, got dropped on her head by accident. And she came backstage and she stormed backstage and went on this stairwell and just lay there for an hour. And she had really hurt her neck and her head and stuff. And that was kind of really scary because she looked like she was in a lot of pain. But I knew she was. I think she'd come off a tour or something. I think she hadn't really had a break. She was wrestling constantly. And when that happened, that was scary to witness because you don't know what's going on and because a lot of people kind of try and work through it and they wrestle hurt. It's really scary to kind of try and help them. And it finishes by saying, yeah, that was scary. And while this is obviously being noted by the interviewee as a particularly scary incident, the incident being recounted is pretty typical. In fact, something very similar happened to this wrestler. And that was the case both in relation to what I saw and in relation to what I was told by interviewees. Folks who'd been concussed would sit backstage. Probably the most common symptom, if there was one, was to be sick. And in the absence of some very obvious symptom, like that vomiting, others in the locker room were just generally oblivious to another's concussion. But action was sometimes taken if the concussion was taken to be particularly severe, in as much as someone might drive the wrestler's car home, or very occasionally take them to hospital if it was felt that it was needed. So what I'm suggesting here really is that in the settings where I worked at least, wrestling is not only non-medicalized in relation to other sports like soccer, it's also frankly non-medicalized in relation to university departments, in the sense that there is an almost complete absence of basic health and safety procedure. Now, I'd elected to study wrestling as part of this project into the concussion crisis precisely because of its lack of overarching top-down governance. But I continue to be surprised by the fact that neither promoter nor training school adopted any of the medical machinery, be that discursive or material, that generally suffuse our everyday lives. And in the wake of that absence, the following question seemed important, and that question was, given that wrestlers do understand what they're doing to be risky and dangerous, both in relation to injury generally and in relation to concussion specifically, what are the emergent ways that wrestlers deal and manage these perceived medical risks in the absence of this institutional framework? And I think unsurprisingly, the answer to that is multifaceted, but I'd like to just focus specifically upon one prominent aspect, and that is the matter of trust. So in trying to think about the role of trust in this context, I'm inspired by two quite distinct sources. First, in a recent article in Social Science and Medicine, Sarah Brothers examines how drug users in the Bay Area, these are drug users who have very little recourse to medical expertise, engage in the assisted injection of drugs. And this is a practice which Brothers describes as very high risk, but a very common activity. And Brothers finds trust to be at the center of these engagements, which take place outside of their medical institutions. Second, and quite differently, in the widely cited essay, People as Infrastructure, Abu Malik Simone argues that daily life in the city of Johannesburg has, quote, depended on the ability of residents to engage in complex combinations of objects, spaces, persons, and practices. These conjunctions became an infrastructure, a platform for and reproducing life in the city, unquote. And while recognizing that wrestlers self-evidently constitute a very different community to those studied by either Brothers or Simone, I want to argue here that pro wrestlers also build an emergent bottom-up infrastructure, that trust plays a particularly key role in this building process, and that trust is discussed explicitly in relation to a lack of formal top-down infrastructure. So the interview from which the extract on the screen is taken from occurred in the wake of two scandals in the British independent wrestling scene. So neither of those scandals were affiliated with my field sites, but they were nonetheless a topic of extensive discussion. In the first instance, a promoter was receiving a significant amount of criticism for apparently pressuring young female wrestlers to give him their phone numbers. In the second, a wrestler had attacked a referee and badly injured them. So a distinction in wrestling is between a work, which is part of the script, and shoot, which is doing it for real, basically. So in this instance, a wrestler had assaulted a referee, basically, when the referee wasn't expecting it. So here, in this extract, the interviewee directly ties both of those events to a lack of regulation and says that in the absence of regulation, it's all about working out if someone can be trusted. And this wrestler phrases trust in quite starkly individualistic terms. He has to decide if someone, be that a promoter or a wrestler, can be trusted. And later in the interview, he goes into quite some detail about how he modifies his wrestling style in the event that he doesn't trust the person that he's working with. Other wrestlers frame the matter of trust in quite clearly relational terms. So a different wrestler said, in response to my question on the topic, that they were not concerned about the lack of health and safety at wrestling shows. Earlier in the interview, however, the wrestler had bemoaned the fact that the wrestling scene in Britain is, quote, oversaturated, and said, quote, there's too many shows run by people who don't know what they're doing, unquote. And attempting to weave these threads together, I asked the wrestler if they'd be worried about working with a less reputable organisation, someone who didn't know what they were doing, if they hadn't seen evidence of medical provision. And the wrestler replied, well, no, it depends who's working on the show with you. If it was people you'd never met before, then or who have a bit of a reputation for being careless, then yeah, I'd be worried. But if I was working on a show with someone I knew, who I trusted, because that's the thing in wrestling, you've got to trust the person you're working with or it doesn't work. Because there's that mutual trust between you, I will look after you, you will look after me, we will look after each other. That's the way wrestling works. When that trust is broken, or you don't trust the other person, or they don't trust you, then what's the point? Why carry on? And so I asked, so actually a huge amount of the health and safety kind of aspect comes from this relationship, and the rest replied that yes, it did. And again, what we see here, I think, is the idea that in the absence of any top-down health and safety regulation, it's a process of mutual trust which facilitates a safe wrestling match. And importantly, this mutual trust involves not only a sense that I will look after you and you will look after me, but also a trust that you will look after yourself. And in the event that you fail to look after yourself, the injury might be expected to follow. So this was something that was elucidated during an interview with a young wrestler while we were talking about a very different topic. So we were talking about gender, and I'd asked the wrestler what it was like to be a woman in a space that continued to be dominated both inside and outside the ring by men. And the interviewee was largely positive, but bemoaned a number of men who continued to be, quote, very derogatory, unquote, before then going on to criticize the attitude of a number of women. So this wrestler said to me, like, I just wrestled a girl who's like, oh, please don't kick me in the face. And I said, it's one of my main falls. I will kick you in the face. I don't aim for your shoulder and then go, I'm going to aim for your shoulder, but just get your hand up in case I get you in the face. I aim for the face and I never miss. And the wrestler stops at this point and asks me, when I do, you know, when they're on all fours and I do the split kick, I literally kick people in the temple and I tell them I'm going to do that. And it's up to them to go like that and get their hand up. Otherwise, you're getting fucking kicked in the head. Sorry for swearing. You'll get kicked in the head otherwise. There's nothing I can do to stop it. I'm aiming for your temple. I'm not aiming anywhere else. And I replied and said, yeah, and they should know it's coming. And the rest said, you know it's coming. We plan it. I'd never do it. If someone's there wrestling with me, they're going to know I'm coming for that if they're on all fours. Like, if they're not, I would never just do it as a shoot ever. Like, I'm not that much of a dick. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think it just sets women's wrestling back so much when people go, oh, I don't want to get hurt. I don't think I've ever wrestled like a fella and then gone, oh, and then people use excuses like, oh yeah, but it's because I've had a concussion before. Like, haven't we all? Like, if you've had such bad concussions, why are you still wrestling? Like, do you know what I mean? And that was literally the excuse that she gave me. And here we both seem to recognize that we've stumbled on a terrain that we've not yet discussed during the interview, but is on the horizon. And the wrestler again stops and says, it's interesting that you're going on about head. This whole thing's about concussion. But I literally kick people in the head. I'm not a dick about it. I don't full pelt kick you, but I'm going for your face. And if you do not get your angle, that's on you, not me. You know I'm going to do that move. So obviously there's a huge amount going on here. But in relation to my immediate questions, I think there's a clear sense that concussions are caused by this breakdown in mutual trust. The interviewee believes that she can be trusted not to be a dick and shoot on her opponent, and in turn, that she trusts her opponent to put their hand up, rendering the kick safe. When this erstwhile opponent fails to put their hand up, trust is lost, and that their opponent is responsible for their own ensuing head injury. So if there's a community here within which an infrastructure built on trust plays a crucial role, then there's a clear sense that those who cannot be trusted, who cannot stop themselves getting hurt, should leave that community. And one of the final things I'll say on this point is that trainee wrestlers are taught at the training school that they must cultivate the ability to be trustworthy and participate in wider wrestling communities. So this was clearly articulated during one training session in December. The trainee wrestlers in this case were reasonably inexperienced and were not yet appearing on shows. And they were undertaking practice matches under the observation of a head coach. And during one of these practice matches, a wrestler was body slammed. And to pause for a moment, a body slam is a move which wrestlers are taught fairly early on in their training. And it simply involves scooping your opponent up before slamming them down onto the flat of their back. Now, key to making this move safe is that the person receiving the move needs to post You can see here that the person is actually, the person in the air is actually bearing a lot of their own weight on the coach's hip. And indeed, this is called posting, and it makes the move incredibly easy to perform. And experienced wrestlers can hold themselves in this position and then complete the flip without any help from their partner. And in the practice match in December, however, it was clear that the trainee wrestler performing the body slam was really struggling to complete the move. And the promoter who I was sitting next to at the time muttered post for him, suggesting that the struggle to complete the slam was primarily the fault of the person receiving the move. And as soon as the practice match finished, the head coach addressed the trainee and said, "You need to learn how to post on a body slam, not only because social services are going to come and take his spine away to a safe place, but because you're going to get dropped on your head. I want to look after you. He wants to look after you. Not everybody does. Someone is just going to drop you on your head because you're a sandbag." And it's an interesting incident, I think, in thinking through trust, how it's cultivated through training, embodied, intimately tied to technique, and shared within a community. And until this trainee is able to demonstrate that they can be trusted, it's unlikely that the coach will recommend that they be given an opportunity to appear on a show. But trust is also key to that booking process. As a different coach slash promoter told me, and discussing their relationship with a third coach and promoter, I think because we know each other so well, we trust the other person to take our classes or vice versa. And that's why we have no problem with, for instance, with the show when we had someone pull out, me going, "Who's ready?" And he can be like, "This person, this person, this person." And I can go, "Okay, we'll take them," literally on that trust issue. Okay, so what I've been arguing for here is a widespread belief that at least some of the time, injury in general and injury in particular are understood as being the consequence of a failure to cultivate trust. That wrestlers may only be admitted into a community when they are trusted, and that a failure to be trustworthy may subsequently result in expulsion from that community. An expulsion that, in the case of our trainee, would have been physically enacted and involved being dropped on his head. And what I'm suggesting is that in the absence of an imposed regulatory infrastructure, wrestlers develop a finely tuned sense of trust, and that the presence of this trust is, at least some of the time, taken as evidence that top-down regulation, bureaucracy, health and safety procedures, and so forth are not necessary. So what then to make of this community wherein participants recognise a significant risk of injury in general and concussion in particular, and yet continue to practice in the more or less complete absence of medical infrastructure, and from what I can see, without any particular concern about that absence? Perhaps the first thing to note is that in population terms, the risk of CTE, concussion, or post-concussion syndrome in wrestling is ultimately unknown. And this is true of WWE, never mind low-level independent wrestling. We have case studies that show they exist to some degree, but beyond that are in the dark and likely to remain so. As scholars in the nascent field of wrestling studies often bemoan, there is little academic or wider public interest in professional wrestling. And what interest there is invariably comes from the social sciences and humanities and not from the neurosciences or biomechanics. Undoubtedly, though, medics and public health officials would be appalled by the picture that I'm painting here. Folks continuing to wrestle through concussions and risking second impacts, unlimited exposure to subconcussive blows, injured wrestlers left on stairwells. At the same time, and while acknowledging that existing ethnographies of wrestling, such as our Tyson Smith's Fighting for Recognition, do paint quite a macabre scene, that I genuinely didn't witness a bloodbath. Certainly I saw more severe injuries in the 3 months I spent with American footballers than I did in the year with wrestlers. On the one hand, Joe Freeman's foundational essay on the tyranny of structurelessness was never far from my mind during this research, and I'm aware that the practices outlined here could be understood as a case study in neoliberal responses to workplace safety in general and the concussion crisis in particular. The lack of regulation in British wrestling and the systemic deregulation of wrestling that has occurred in the United States since the late 1980s has been directly tied to monopolistic thinking and tax avoidance strategies from companies like the WWE. In this context, I'm conscious that the community of trust, a community often articulated by its members as a wrestling family, aligns very clearly with an argument from an argument in Melinda Cooper's book, Family Values. So in that book, Cooper argues that neoliberal thinkers have demonstrated a strong commitment to family, not primarily for ethical reasons, but because in the absence of a welfare state, the family is articulated as the site of a social safety net, where dependents are cared for in the absence of state intervention. In the coupling of neoliberal deregulation and some form of neoconservative family, then, wrestling may be articulated as having, however surprisingly, a synoptical relationship with contemporary manifestations of capitalism, wherein risk is individualized and subjects rendered solely responsible for their own health. In this reading, the flourishing communities of trust in wrestling may be little more than a demonstration of, as Anna Singh has phrased it, the possibility of life amongst the capitalist ruins. On the other hand, at the training school, my point of contradistinction to wrestling was the heavily regulated gymnastics club located in the same building. And despite those regulations, gymnastics is a sport that, over the past few years, has been revealed to have allowed truly appalling and systemic abuse. In academic settings, the likes of David Graeber have seen bureaucracy, regulation, and paperwork as key elements in the foreclosure of radical change. And there is good reason to give that view an airing in the context of sporting practice. In the classic Coming On Strong, for example, Susan Kahn discusses how, in coming under the purview of existing regulatory bodies, such as the National Collegiate Athletic Association, much of women's sport has been, quote, subsumed into an existing model viewed by many as fundamentally sexist, elitist, and exploitative, unquote. And Ben Liverland has likewise detailed how, in the early 20th century, the Football Association violently cracked down on any attempt to imagine soccer differently. So it's unsurprising then that in a context where nearly all responses to the concussion crisis have been mediated through the existing infrastructure of sports governing bodies, Kathleen Bakinski has found that, quote, fundamentally altering sport has not been part of the framework advanced by those seeking policy changes to improve sports safety, unquote. And also that governing bodies have been consistently criticised for slow and insufficient action on concussion. There have been parliamentary hearings in the UK just over the last week or two on this very point. And in response to these failings, a frequent call from critical scholars of sport is to ask for more regulation, more state intervention, more top-down concussion-specific infrastructure. But as Bowker and Starr have argued, the very essence of the politics of infrastructure lies in, quote, walking a tightrope between increased visibility and increased surveillance, between over-specifying what one should do and taking away discretion from individual practitioners, unquote. And in building regulatory infrastructure, there are undoubtedly costs and exclusions. As Starr says elsewhere, there are millions of tiny bridges built into large-scale infrastructures and millions of literal and metaphoric public buses that cannot pass through them. In centralising people in its emerging infrastructure, wrestling provides, and to use a phrase of Liverland's, an enduring possibility of how sport could be otherwise. The question, as Starr has it, is cui bono, an infrastructure for whom and at what cost? And I'll leave it there. Thank you. This is a couple of early publications which come out of this project. Look forward to some questions.